Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.
And welcome to this episode of Yogananda Podcast, where we'll be discussing the second part of Chapter 6, the Tiger Swami. So with no further ado, we'll jump into it. We have today Chris, I'll be hosting, and Lauren, Priyanka, Mike, all the four of us today, taking you through this part of the chapter. If you do want to read along with us, you can do. The scope of this episode should be, unless we go off piece too much, and the time trickles into the hours rather than the minutes as we intend it to be. You can read from "The mind is the wielder of muscles" all the way down to, if I can get it here, "The tale does not impress me. I considered that father had been the credulous victim of a deluded fanatic." So we're going to read this if you want to pause and read along, and if we do miss any kind of insights that you want to share with us, please do share. So let's jump into it then. So there's a paragraph here that is just, it's got so much substance to it. It's going to be hard actually to try to summarize it in, my own words, and I'll do my best not to read verbatim. But in essence, there's a great paragraph by the Tiger Swami talking to Yogananda and his friend about how the mind is the wielder of muscles, that the force of a hammer blow depends really on the energy applied, and that the bodily instrument and the power expressed by it is depending on the aggressiveness of will and courage. So the body is very much literally manufactured, he says, and sustained by mind. So that's already, a couple sentences there, really impactful. Priyank, what's your initial take?
From your school science, you'll remember force is mass times acceleration, or is it mass times area? Sorry, no, mass times area. So it also depends on the size of your fist and how heavy you are.
Right. So never mess with anybody with sizable hands. Then, yeah.
I also love how he said aggressive will. Like, he didn't just say, willpower and courage. It's aggressive. You've got to be really forceful with it. But it's an interesting use of word. I know Paramahansayogananda uses dynamic, which I have to say I relate to a bit more than aggressive, but both work.
I think it was mass times acceleration. That sounded right. So gonna go with that. And it's so interesting that because we always think of having to do something physical to achieve something physical, but here the concept is you do something mental and then something physical happens, right?
Yeah, and Yogananda goes into this in detail in many different texts about the strength of the mind. So we'll look at what Yogananda has to say on all of this subject matter, because it is substantial. We could probably, I've said before, spend a whole episode really just on this subject and break it down and look at the significance, but we'll do our best to summarize some of the material out there that Yogananda has. Priyank?
Yes, and with reference to your dynamic will versus aggressive will, here he's literally talking about punching or like a hammer. So has to use aggressive. Dynamic would be for things like trying to control the power of your senses and your restraint and things like that. Maybe, don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's given the boys a lesson essentially as to how he got to where he got to, and the boys are wide-eyed and drinking it in. So they're very much enjoying the conversation, as we'll find out. The Tiger Swami does go on to say that it's very much through the pressure of instincts from past lives that strengths and weaknesses come through into this human consciousness, into this life. So it carries through. So, you can take from that. It's in the lessons, actually, Yogananda says as well, like, look out for mannerisms or behaviors of people that you've known from past lives, because it will manifest still in them today in this life, which I think is a really cool idea. So that we have these strengths and weaknesses of the body that percolates through from past lives that come from the mind, essentially. So he's saying that the habits, the desirable and undesirable, manifest in the body. and that outward frailty is a mental origin. I was just apologizing to the guys before I jumped on this podcast. The air conditioning in this room is gone for my throat, but now I'm thinking, actually, is it a mental frailty? They've got me thinking, is it something in the mind that's causing my voice to sort of weaken? So he says, the mental frailty really comes through in the physical form, which is fascinating, and that the habit-bound body thwarts the mind. And so he goes on to then say about the servant and the master and the relationship between the mind and the body. So it's fascinating from the Tiger Swami here, and so much to unpack. But Yogananda, as I mentioned, does talk a lot about this, and just trying to look up some of the most impactful statements, if you could possibly do that in Yogananda's text. I was looking at the journey to self-realization, and there's I think 4 titles there that mention about the mind. The youth is a state of mind and soul as well as the body. Old age is a state of mind, not even mindedness, the right foundation for one's existence. And then if you keep your mind with God, you will be free. So those are chapters just in that one book. So he really does push, the importance of the mind over your well-being in all aspects of well-being. Brent?
Just going back to the body is manufactured, and he says literally manufactured and sustained by the mind. So that's pretty profound, isn't it? I mean, you get images of like people being able to like grow limbs or whatever. Because if you can manufacture, if your mind can manufacture the body, you should be able to like regenerate anything, any weakness, any problem that you have, you should be able to correct it if you have a strong mind, and also sustain it, of course, as well. Didn't they do some tests on like some animals, and they were able to regrow some limb or something, if I recall? And some insects or animals can do it, but obviously we seem not to be able to have the same power, even though Yogananda says we should.
Yeah, I think with technology as well, we're going to be able to do all sorts of things in the near future, but what you're talking about is something even more exceptional, isn't it? But we do have an example of that in the book already that we were talking about, where the policeman chopped off the arm of the saint that they thought was a criminal. And that was pretty miraculous in some ways, that he was able just to sort of reattach that limb. So he was able to, I guess, think his way into healing and health. But he said it was by the grace of Divine Mother. He didn't take any egotistical strength from it, I suppose. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, and one that Yogananda does push through in the Law of Success. Such a good little booklet going over that again. I thought maybe we could read through a little bit of it, because it overlaps with a lot about what the Tiger Swami's saying, but really in Yogananda's own thoughts. And in the booklet, if anybody doesn't have it, you can easily get it on the Kindle. It's only £1 or £2 or something. But he talks about the power of thought, and that we demonstrate success or failure according to the habit trend of thought, and that the will is the dynamo. So as we're talking about the will, that he says every outward manifestation is the result of will, and is the spring of all our actions. And Lauren, maybe you could read a little bit about what he goes on to say about controlling destiny, that we're going to delve into in the next part of this chapter.
He says, mind is the creator of everything. You should therefore guide it to create only good. If you cling to a certain thought with dynamic willpower, it finally assumes a tangible outward form. When you are able to employ your will always for constructive purposes, you become the controller of your destiny.
Nice. Mike, can you take us on? These are all page upon page, as you turn the page in this book, ordered in this way. So it's very well structured, for it overlaps with what the Tiger Swami says.
Fear exhausts life energy. The human brain is a storehouse of life energy. This energy is constantly employed in muscular movements. Fear exhausts life energy. It is one of the greatest enemies of dynamic willpower. Fear causes the life force that ordinarily flows steadily through the nerves to be squeezed out, and the nerves themselves to become as though paralyzed. The vitality of the whole body is lowered.
So that's a little bit about what Yogananda says in the Law of Success booklet. Such a nice, to the point summary, really, of a lot of his thoughts on this subject. But the fear thing is pretty important, isn't it? Because it's the Tiger Swami, when he goes into a cage, he was not fearful. If he had have been fearful, like everything else would have went out the window. You know, he would be immobilized. And I know that myself because I've got a fear of heights that I'm trying to get over. My body just stops functioning sometimes, even though I jumped out of a plane and bungee jumped. So I'm trying to get over it. Mike?
Like, I wouldn't consider myself as a particularly fearful person, but there's no way I would go into a cage with a tiger. So I think that's the complete opposite. He has like enormous courage and enormous belief in his own strength.
I really like this section where he also says that the outward frailty has a mental origin, and in a vicious circle, the habit-bound body thwarts the mind. And then the next sentence goes along the same vein as to why that's a problem. So habits are created by us essentially in the mind, and then once they're established, then they weaken our minds and weaken our capability to overcome them. A vicious circle is really well explained in these 2 or 3 lines, isn't it? Just thought there's only good examples where that's true. Chris, does it apply to your fear of heights? Because like I suppose it probably came from the mind, but now like it's become a physiological thing. So whenever you're near height, then your mind, yeah,
exactly. My father-in-law is in Portugal, where I am at the moment, and he said, let's go for a hike tomorrow. So I'm going for a hike tomorrow. And then I looked at, you had to buy tickets as to where we're going. And so I looked at them, and it turns out it was the first, but now the second largest suspense bridge in the world. So I'm going to be going over this like metal gridded, so you can see through the bridge. You know, it's 200 meters in the air. So I'm going to be able to put this sort of teaching into practice, where the mind over the body. So my body might convulse and sort of freeze up, I guess, but you know, let's see. This is a very apt episode for me to really try to apply the mind over body technique. So Prank, to finalize some of the thoughts on this on a cheery note, because it's such a beautiful subject. There's a quote there from Yogananda. Could you read it to us, please?
Can. There is no excuse for a wrong state of mind. You must be always positive-minded, cheerful, smiling, vibrant. By all means, practice this mental youthfulness that comes from the core of your being.
Beautiful. So yeah, overcome anything with the power of the mind. Lauren?
I loved it when it said from the core of your being, because I genuinely feel like we are all just joyful beings at heart, but we just forget and get clouded by other mental habits and ways. But truly that's the essence of us, isn't it? As the soul, not this humanness that we think we are. We are the joy and love of God itself. So yeah, it's a really, really important one to remember for us all.
Yeah, I think there's so many beautiful quotes from Yogananda that you could literally just sit here and bask in it all day, couldn't you? All these various quotes.
Yeah.
But young Mukunda was really eager to hear more about the Tiger Swami and what he was up to. So he was pressing with his friend to the Tiger Swami to tell them more about his own life, as it says here. So we'll delve into more of the early ambition that the Tiger Swami had and overcoming his weaknesses. So interestingly here, the Tiger Swami says, you know, my early ambition was to fight tigers. Imagine if anybody told you that today. What do you want to do with your life? I should fight tigers. I've always wanted to fight tigers. Yeah, I think I would be gobsmacked. I wouldn't really know how to come back to that. Mike?
I think I would even discourage it. I would think this doesn't sound like a sound plan for your life. Maybe stop it. And I would have completely ruined his life because that was his calling.
I think, Mike, especially with you being in the States nowadays, you probably might encounter something similar, but they may say my earliest need was to fight bears. I suppose you would say the same thing to that stupid ambition.
I don't know what you're trying to say, Brian.
There's more bears than tigers where you live.
Yeah, I don't know many people here fighting bears though. But yeah, okay, I get your point.
You know, occasionally I see like the UFC world popping up, and they say that a lot of Eastern European dudes, like I don't know, Kazakhstan or something, they fight tigers or bears. Sorry, that's pretty hardcore.
Imagine you would add bears to UFC. That would be next level, but I don't think it would be like friendly for animals.
For the record, it's like play fighting. I don't think they're actually going toe to toe. But here we have the Tiger Swami declaring that his earliest ambition was to fight tigers, and he follows up with something I think is invariably connected, where he says that my will was mighty, but my body was feeble. And it made me think, you know, why the ambition to fight tigers? Where would this come from? And this physical weakness that he mentions immediately after this statement of his ambition, it must be linked, you know. So I just thought, how often are we sort of propelled in some sort of opposite direction to try to egotistically sort of prove ourselves right, that we can do something. So it's under the guise of positivity, but actually, you know, through the ego, we get led astray maybe. But Lauren?
Yeah, but do you know, I also feel like it's part of the soul's purpose, right? To overcome. And like, you know, it's like when they say, you know, when we're suffering, we want to get out of that suffering and have the opposite. And that's kind of what it feels like here. You know, his body seems to be failing him, but he's thinking, no, actually, I'm not going to accept this fate, and I'm going to use my willpower, and I want to go fight tigers. And I feel like we could all do with that vigor, you know, with our mental and other things to face. So yeah, I think it's quite actually inspirational.
Yeah, I kind of thought it was maybe, you know, it leads him on to this path that we know he's called the Tiger Swami, right? So, you know, all roads lead to God eventually. So he was going down a very intense one, right? And this was something that he had to actually use this power of the mind and use the God-given abilities that he had to such an extreme extent that maybe it actually is, you know, a reasonably fast track to sort of coming up against the wall. Is we'll find out, you know, he does eventually come up against that wall, and then seek other ways for fulfillment, which he does. So I thought, sorry, Priyank.
Quickly at the start of this section, it says, at our entreaty, the Swami consented to tell us about his life. This is, I think, I just missed another like little hint about how we should talk about ourselves. I.e., unless asked, don't just go on about your life.
Yeah, it's pretty good insight, to be fair. And it's kind of like the opposite to what Yogananda was talking about when he bumped into his friend that just would not leave him alone. Which is nice spot. So, you know, we have the boys then eager to find out more. You know, they're wide-eyed. They're, you know, probably looking up with glee. You know, happy that the Swami Tiger is really engaging them in this conversation in his own house. You know, he's just after punching a brick out of his wall, and you know he's giving them a real show, isn't he? So the boys are enjoying themselves. And it says an ejaculation of surprise broke from me, and I thought actually here we have Yogananda, and he goes on to say, you know, as a young boy Mukunda, that he observes the Swami Tiger having Atlantean shoulders fit to bear. You know, how could this man ever know weakness? So the Swami's just said that, you know, his body was feeble at one point, so this maybe drove him to getting strong. And Yogananda just can't believe it. You know, he's like, wow, how could you ever have been anything but what you are now? You know, this mammoth of a man. And there's a couple of things here. One that I thought was Yogananda does talking the lessons that will not go into too much detail, but essentially he says that there's the habit of the mind that it struggles to actually perceive anything different from what it's experiencing now, in a sense. So if you're sick, it struggles then to perceive you as healthy, and when you're healthy, it struggles to sort of see you as sick. So you know, you think one of those things will never end, but inevitably they probably will, you know. And that sort of struck me there, that, you know, we have this immediate sort of, we fall into that groove of thinking, don't we, where we think something's always permanent. So it just reminded me of that nice lesson that Yogananda gives us. But secondly, it's Yogananda as a young Mukunda was very thin himself, wasn't he, Prank? He was very, very thin. I was probably the opposite. I was a bit chubby when I was a kid, and I got very thin, and then went down the other path. But when I was a little bit thin, I remember one of a great friend who passed now on the SRF path. She was saying, right, close your eyes and just imagine. You know, you got to really imagine it. You got to believe it first if you're going to be putting on weight in these things. And you know, that's such a great lesson, and we do know it from later in this book that he goes into in some detail as to how he managed to do it as a young boy Mukunda.
Yeah, he had chronic dyspepsia, I think, and he'll employ similar techniques as the Tiger Swami does to overcome his physical feebleness. I was exceptionally thin, probably up till the age of 18, and then, but I didn't do it get bigger by this mental method. I did it through just going to the gym. It worked, but possibly it was much slower. And it's not I'm not claiming to be a hench Arnie, Mike, before you come in, but I was very, very thin. And like the previous episode picture, if you saw Mukunda, you know, the picture of Mukunda meditating when he's like 16 or 17 and he's exceptionally thin, it's similar. I was actually exactly the same physique. A lot of people in India, or boys in India, are, I suppose. Mike,
I really like the comparison you brought, just using pure willpower or going to the gym, because in some ways, isn't the gym somehow like a stepping stone to developing willpower? Because you develop a routine and you need to use your willpower to do it every single day. And in some ways you're training your body, but in another way, you're also training your will, right? To form your body.
Yeah, it's the number one thing that stops people from achieving their goals, isn't it? Like they start in the gym in sort of in the West anyway, in January, February, after they eat too much over Christmas time probably. And then by sort of March, the gyms are empty. So it's pretty, yeah, you're quite right. And Yogananda does say that, right? If you want to grow your willpower, you have to actually just focus on one thing and be determined to do it. And it can be small, you know, just tidying your room or something, you know, choose something small and then build on that, right? That's how Yogananda says that's how you build this force of will, which is really cool. Take small, don't try to do it all in one go. And Yogananda had some help, right, with that story that you were talking about. So I'm sure Sri Yukteswarji, which we'll talk about in a later episode.
Chapter 12.
Chapter 12, there you go. he was there to show Yogananda, young Mukunda, the way. So these influences that we have in our life are really powerful. So we don't necessarily need to only rely on ourselves. We have so many good gurus and people to show us the way as well. So Yogananda then goes on to say that, that how could you ever have known weakness? And Swami, Tiger Swami, then says that he really persistently thought of health and strength, and that's really what overcame his handicap. As we talked about, this is the key to using the mind. You have to use the will and really be persistent with it. So that's a really nice little lesson in there for us as well. Now, one thing that I did want to touch on is this strength of the mind, and there's more to sort of pull out of Yogananda's text that I thought maybe we could just read out, and it's from Man's Eternal Quest on the strength of the mind. And maybe Lauren, would you be kind enough to kick us off? We can read a few excerpts from that.
God has given us one tremendous instrument of protection, more powerful than machine guns, electricity, poison gas, or any medic: the mind. It is the mind that must be strengthened.
Nice. Priyank, can you?
An important part of the adventure of life is to get hold of the mind and to keep that controlled mind constantly attuned to the Lord. This is the secret of a happy, successful existence.
It comes by exercising mind power and by attuning the mind to God through meditation. The easiest way to overcome disease, disappointments, and disasters is to be in constant attunement with God.
There you go. So maybe it was the Tiger Swami not quite at this point in time in his development in constant attunement with God. We're going to touch on that again at the end of the episode. Bear that in mind. Priyank?
Yeah, so the Mukunda later on, when, as you mentioned, Swami Sri Yukteswar was helping him overcome his mental, blockades and gaining weight. He said that medicines have limitations, but the divine creative force has none. So believe that, and you shall be well and strong. So it's imparting like the realization of, that God is the ultimate doer into your your will, your baby will, as it were. And then it becomes like Atlantean will, doesn't it? As it's described in this section. But then this is also similar to how the Tiger Swami describes it, Soham Swami, and then he says he calls it indomitable persistency of thoughts of health and strength. And then he also said that he described this as a compelling mental vigor. So it's compelling that it's such a great way of existing that it should be compelling for us all to exist in that state of mind. A really nice way of saying those, or convincing us to live in that reality.
Yeah, and he did say in the previous, when we covered it in the previous episode, that he said there are many people out there as strong as me, as capable physically, but actually he's saying here that this mental vigor was, he found that to be the real subduer of royal Bengals, which is really cool, isn't it? It's the mind over matter, and as we talked about, Yogananda definitely seems to have agreed based on some of the texts that we've read on. So really nice. I wonder if you could talk to Yogananda now, how much he learned from this one meeting with the Tiger Swami and how he applied that into his teachings. It seems like possibly quite a lot, hence why he's including it in the autobiography of a yogi. But as we go on, then there's going to be the tigers. We're going to look at that as the symbolic of inner prowlers, as the Tiger Swami says. And we have a very cute, very innocent sort of question from young Mukunda, and he's still very much enjoying this conversation with the Tiger Swami, and he says, Do you think, revered Swami, that I could ever fight tigers? And you could just imagine, young, skinny, Mukunda there standing wide-eyed and asking the Tiger Swami that question. And yeah, the Tiger Swami very sweetly then replies saying yes. So I thought that was very, very nice. But Mike?
Yeah, I was always wondering why he actually asked that, because it's such a, I don't see him being that kind of person at all. I don't know, like when I think of fighting tigers, I feel bad for the tigers, but he also says that he only had that wish for like a second, right? And then it never came back to him. Maybe it was more about that he wanted to know the answer, that the answer is yes, because whatever you put your mind to, you can achieve it, right?
Yeah, I think it probably does stem from, if I was to try to get into young Mukunda's head, but the like state that he thought he was in compared to the Tiger Swami in his youth. He was in a state, a more feeble physical state than what he was in his later years. And so he probably thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it, as opposed to really thinking about the tigers, as you say. That's kind of crazy. But he does correct himself here pretty quickly to say that it was the first and last time that the bizarre ambition ever visited his mind. So he does recognize that by no means was he actually intending to fight the tigers.
I wonder if they used this section as inspiration. Hollywood used it to create that film, The Revenant, where the whole film is literally about fighting a bear. But that Leonardo DiCaprio, whatever the character is, he's completely unprepared, so he's getting completely butchered. But his will is so strong, and even though he's almost completely massacred, he somehow overcomes it, in a similar vein to how Tiger Swami does a bit later.
Maybe we'll have to write to them and ask. Yeah.
They'll never admit it though. They're like, no, I dreamt it.
Got secret devotees all over the world. So then we have the very sweet response, yes, that there's a smile then on the Tiger Swami's face. And he says, you can, but there are many different kinds of tigers that roam in the jungles of human desires. So he quite quickly, I think, here recognizes that, Yogananda, probably his path isn't going to be fighting tigers and, brawling with them in cages. It's actually more on the spiritual path. And he pivots, doesn't he? He pivots the conversation quite nicely. And he says, there's no spiritual benefit from, knocking out beasts, as he says, knocking them unconscious, but rather, be the victor of your inner prowlers. And it's such a strong statement from him there that I'm sure, would have put the boys into some thinking at the time. Mike?
Yeah, it's like a Bhagavad Gita-esque comparison, right? Like you compare fighting your cousins to fighting your inner kind of bad habits. And in the same way, he compares it now to the tigers, right?
It's such a good representation, isn't it, of these prowlers? What is he actually talking about when he's talking about the inner prowlers? What do you think?
I think he's it could be many, but in the couple of lines later, he refers to the same prowlers as wild passions. So I think he's talking about the gross ones, which are lust, greed, anger, the kind of the destructive ones. So as opposed to the subtle ones like jealousy and things like that, or materiality. So I think it's those gross ones. Personally, and it's interesting because in the previous chapter, the perfume saint, he says it in a similar way, that philosopher that he was debating with, he said the human mind, bared to a centuried slime, is teeming with the repulsive life of countless world delusions. Struggles of the battlefield pale into insignificance here when man first contends with inner enemies. No mortal foes these, to be overcome by a harrowing array of might. And then he carries on. So it's a similar, really subtly, Yogananda is kind of teaching us that these are baser kind of like passions and flaws are there, and they're really, really challenging to overcome. Like, for example, if you had addiction to alcohol and you stopped drinking alcohol over a few weeks, that doesn't mean that that was more difficult than like overcoming anger or jealousy. These other things that are much more like embedded in our personalities and our egos and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking into this preparation for this episode, I was trying desperately to find a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, and I just could not find it for life of me. But I remember it's in the back of my mind that essentially in the Bhagavad Gita they were saying, it was Yogananda's commentary, I think, that common man will get trampled by the beasts of these desires. Essentially, they'll go to war with these inner prowlers, trying to get on top of them, trying to overcome them, but in the end gets sort of tangled in them and sort of mangled and trampled. Whereas the wisdom was to say that don't try to sort of engage them head on. You have to go to God first. So don't forget to prioritize God, which really stuck with me, because I think the ego wants to say, no, I can overcome any and all sort of inner prowler, but actually put God first and then everything else secondary.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that, isn't there, Chris? Because it's like we got ourselves in this mess. So how do we think we're going to be the ones to get ourselves out? And yeah, we need to rely more strongly upon the one that can actually help us. But I do always think of, it's 25% our effort, 25% guru, and 50% God. And that says so much, because, yes, we need to do our part. We can't just sit here and, hope it will happen. But ultimately, that bigger percentage comes from the Almighty, which is a very uplifting thought.
Grace of God. But if you don't ask, then you may not get. So like you got free like assistance if you just ask or tune into that assistance. And then it should be easier to conquer those wild passions, or what do they call it? Jungles of human desires.
And this really does, by the Tiger Swami, sort of plant a seed, I would imagine, in young Mukunda's mind. And grown up now, Yogananda does talk about these, the battle that we go through, let's say, with the inner prowlers. Talks about bad habits quite extensively throughout the various sort of speeches and books and lessons that he puts together. But Lauren, maybe you could read out one of the quotes there on bad habits.
Your greatest enemies are your bad habits. They will follow you from one incarnation to another until you overcome them. In order to free yourself from fate, you must cure yourself of bad habits. How? Good company is one of the best medicines. If you have a tendency to drink, mix with people who do not. If you are suffering from ill health, be with people who have positive minds, who don't think about sickness. If you have the consciousness of failure, associate with those who have the consciousness of success. Then you will begin to change.
Each of your habits creates a specific groove or pathway in the brain. These patterns make you behave in a certain way, often against your wish. Your life follows those grooves that you yourself have created in the brain. In that sense, you are not a free person. You are more or less a victim of the habits you have formed. Depending on how set these patterns are, to that degree, you are a puppet.
But you can neutralize the dictates of those bad habits. How? By creating brain patterns of opposite good habits. And you can completely erase the grooves of bad habits by meditation. There is no other way. However, you can't cultivate good habits without good company and good environment. And you can't free from bad habits without good company and meditation.
It's funny, like whenever I got onto the path of meditation, I did it quite intensely at the very beginning. And I was eating meat, I was drinking alcohol and these things at the beginning. I've probably said this on the podcast before, but without any ambition, I just stopped those things. And this really, like, I felt like this teaching here, I lived it, I actually really experienced this rewiring of the brain. So it's so true, isn't it? Imagine if you could go to every alcohol anonymous session and be like, by the way, have you considered meditating? Like, like that maybe is the one way you're really going to get rid of all the ambitions and the desires. So there's Yogananda stating the truth very plainly, simply.
I think the same is also true the opposite way. So if you are like someone who is like, I think when I was born, I had like spiritual inclinations, but my environment wasn't like that at all. And I wasn't very mindful of the environment that I had. And so, and then I kind of felt like I was never really into alcohol, like that never really did much for me. But then everyone else did it. So I was like, what the hell? Let's just have a beer or something. And yeah, I guess in that sense, it's later easier to get rid of it again. But I feel if I wouldn't have like read more about Guruji and found better company, I would have probably gone down a wrong path that way. And I guess in that same way, you can go up a positive path, right?
Environment is so important, isn't it? Like it creates such a big impact on us all. But something that very clearly kind of spoke to me while I was reading this is that I think it could be quite easy for someone to get discouraged if they are analyzing their life and thinking, well, I don't have the good company around me and I don't have that. It's not accessible to me. And, I was reflecting on my own journey, and I think sometimes we are able to become that good company that we seek first before it then appears outwardly. And that can have a huge impact on how we're able to overcome these bad habits in our minds. Because really, the only company we really have is ourselves and God, which, all interlinked. So, yes, if it's not outward, one day it shall be. As I can see here, I'm sitting with all of you beautiful people, lovely, great company. But yeah, sometimes we don't have that. And until we do, we can cultivate that in ourselves for sure.
I think that's a really, really good point, Lauren. Like the kind of language we use in our mind to talk to ourselves really matters, right? And the way we kind of look at the things that we do in retrospect. Yeah, I guess that's like the number one suggestion that you get when you are on the path. But that's something that really helps there is introspection, right? When you write it down, then you often see that kind of back and forth.
There's Yogananda was saying that habits are so stubborn. They don't just you can't shake them too easily, and they do chase you from one life to the next. He says even if you were to flee the jungle, your old habits would be with you still. You can't run away from them, so you may as well strive to overcome them. Clear out the jungle of your wrong habits, then you will be free. And he was saying that the stubbornness of the habits can somewhat be overcome by the subconscious impressions that you can give them. So we use mantras and different things for that. And one that I actually found very powerful many years ago, I was chanting this over and over again, was I can change, I have the will to change, I will change. That's a lovely one. I'm sure we probably all have our own little quotes this way, like I am free from that habit now, I am free. So, Yogananda gives us all these tools to sort of shake loose and, overcome the inner prowlers, as the Tiger Swami says to the two boys. And then really we're looking at this next section of the chapter. And as Yogananda puts it, from taming tigers to taming passions. And again, the Tiger Swami is being pressed to say, sir, how did you change from being a tamer of wild tigers to being a tamer of wild passions? And at this point, the Tiger Swami, as it says, fell into silence, and that a remoteness came into his gaze, and that he was summoning visions of bygone years. So he was clearly going into his memory bank, and Yogananda observed that maybe there was a slight mental struggle for the Tiger Swami in his decision to share these memories with him. I thought very, very interesting little paragraph there that Yogananda decided to include. Priyank, what's your take?
It's exceptionally interesting, and in keeping with when profound elements of people's lives or transformative elements of people's lives are being recounted, there's always a period. You've got in this book, there's always a period of silence, remoteness, and introspection, and like being one with gratitude. You get that kind of feeling, and this is like, I just counted, this is the 6th time that we've had this kind of experience in the book. The first time was Mukunda's father, when he was talking about his, Mukunda was trying to arrange, or someone was trying to arrange a nurse for him, and then he said, devotion to me ended with your mother, and his eyes went remote, which was very sweet. And then second time was when he was hearing about his mother's death, and that mystic who came to see him and saying that this next illness shall be your last. Then Mukunda's mother, Gyana Prabhu Ghosh, went into this stillness and only felt this peace, because obviously this was going to be a very profound experience for her. And then the next one was the police officer, when he was relating the story of severing the arm of that sadhu. Next one was Swami Pranabananda, saint with 2 bodies, when he was relating his experiences with Lahiri Mahashaya. And then there was Shastri Mahashaya, who we talked about in the previous couple of chapters ago, and he was relating his experiences with Lahiri Mahashaya as well. And then now this is the 6th such occasion. So the concept is like, there's a remoteness in someone's eyes, they may go a bit glassy eyed, and there's stillness, there's silence, there's feeling of peace, and everyone really enjoys that. So that's, I think it's really, really good concept in this book that's drawn out in various elements of the passage, because he could have just omitted these kind of lines, couldn't he? But he made it really deliberate and obvious to put it in there for us to really enjoy it. So I think we should keep counting these moments, and let's put a name to it, remoteness or silence or something, and we'll make it a concept maybe we can aspire to in our own day-to-day life, offline lives.
Yeah, I definitely think so too, because so often we just blurt things out, don't we? And actually what's going on here is he's seemingly deciding, as it says here, he's deciding whether to grant his request, but also deciding whether to share it. And there's that old saying, think before you speak, but it's so true, and I think, well, definitely for me, you should have that moment where you tune in with your intuition and think, okay, well, should I be saying this? Should I be sharing this? Why am I saying this? It might not be as easy to have some free-flowing conversations, but it's probably better in the long run. So another good life lesson. It's full of life lessons, this book. If you really look for them, they are everywhere.
Yeah. There was I don't know about remoteness in the eyes. I suppose it's like going inward. We need to come up with a name somehow for that, Priyank. You're right. But it did just jog a memory that I heard one US president, I can't remember who it was. I think it was either Truman or Eisenhower, that used to, in meetings, in high level meetings, close his eyes to be able to make a decision. And just, it's somewhat of a sensory deprivation, to try to, as we close our eyes in meditation, we keep them shut. It maybe has some sort of similar approach to it, where you're actually delving into another realm of thought or perception. But yeah, very, very interesting, isn't it, that he sort of considered, as Yogananda or young Mukunda thought, whether or not he was actually going to share or grant the request. But he smiled and did so. And so he goes to tell the boys a pretty fascinating story that we'll cover across this episode, but it will go into the next episode. And he says that essentially his pride became an intoxication for him, because he had got a certain level of fame and success in what he was doing. And so that really became he became drunk on the toxin of pride. Priyank?
Yeah, which answers the question we were asking last time. Not question, we were raising a point about what was his downfall. And I think one of us said that it was overconfidence. Then he obviously lost his nearly lost that battle in that with Begum, with that tiger, Raja Begum or whatever it's called, that tiger. But here he's surmising all of his downfall to the intoxication of pride. So he became arrogant and started doing tricks and playing with tiger, as opposed to just doing what what was needed.
That's the apology. It needs to go out to anybody who hasn't read the book and is actually following along with us. Spoiler alert. Yeah. No.
Oh yeah.
He does go on to fight this fearsome tiger. And runs into some difficulties, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? He sort of goes into murkier and murkier waters as he goes on here, and he sort of tells the boys that he was trying to make the tigers, display them in front of people in public and make them do various tricks. And his ambition, as he says here, which is an interesting point, then he says, was to force the savage beasts to behave like domestic ones, as opposed to fighting them. He's sort of gone to almost humiliation for the tigers, so he's straying from this initial ambition, which was to prove his might and to kind of overcome his weakness, his mental or physical frailty. But now he's misusing that power to some extent, right? So he's kind of gone off the track, if he was on the right track to begin with fighting tigers, that is. But he's there sort of misusing this power. And there's a strong message in this section. Sorry, before I go into it, Mike, do you want to jump in?
It's a really strong path that he's taken, a really interesting path, right? Because he says he's born and he always had the inclination to fight tigers, which is strange. But then in some ways that willpower he builds up while he's fighting tigers, it helps him also later to fight those inner tigers, right? So it essentially, it's kind of his path to self-realization, which I find really fascinating. I wonder how that came about, what happened in his last life to actually having to go down a path like this.
Yeah, if you look at the analogy, like how many inner demons would represent something as ferocious as a tiger, like in reality, we have the dragon, which is pretty symbolic in many stories about overcoming this inner beast. The dragon probably is the ultimate, but if you look at animals that we could think about that would symbolize this great inner beast or beasts that we sort of overcome, then tiger is definitely one of them. So maybe he is manifesting that in his reality.
Tigers is also a great animal, isn't it? Because they're very calculative. They see where their prey's weaknesses, and then they, they slowly go in and then they pounce. And I feel like that's exactly what goes on in this inner world. It knows our weaknesses, it knows where to get us, and it will try and pounce. And it's a constantly on the battlefield, as the Bhagavad Gita tells us. But it's so true. And I think perhaps this is why, they're described as inner prowlers, because it definitely feels like the tigers within.
I mean, if the tiger is the inner prowler, then what are we? Are we the lamb, the innocent lamb, or are we, getting pounced on by the big tiger? We're made in God's image. That's what we are. So he does say something that's really insightful here. He says, with gratifying success. So he talks about being sort of publicly humiliating these big cats, and he says with gratifying success. So he began to perform these feats publicly, and the word gratifying. If again you're like me and you need to look up some definitions of words from time to time, it means the giving pleasure or satisfaction, and we sort of know like that's more related to the senses than the higher self. So there's the lower self and the higher self. So he lets us see that through the window of his mind what was going on. So he sought these lower senses to gratify himself. So that was a nice inclusion there by the Tiger Swami. And he goes on then to say that his father, who's an interesting character, no doubt, was in a pensive mood, and he came in to talk to the young Tiger Swami, and he came with words of warning. He then says that there's coming ills produced by the grinding wheels of cause and effect, presuming he's referring to karma there. And the Tiger Swami sort of pushes back to say, your superstition shouldn't discolor the powerful waters of my activities. So he immediately pushes back. There's no hesitation. He doesn't want to hear what his dad says, in a sense, but the father then pushes on, and he rebukes what he says, that I'm no fatalist, to use the Tiger Swami's words, but he does believe in the retribution that is taught in the Holy Scriptures. So we know actually that just in later texts that the father meditates, and he discusses this, as we're going to go into, premonition by a saint. So he himself would have been somebody with, I'm sure, some insights, given his position here. But he gets rebuked then. So he says that to the Tiger Swami that there's resentment against you in the jungle family. I thought that was such a great line, and I've heard it before about souls in the animal kingdom, and people talk about souls being in mountains, and these kind of things that you shouldn't mistreat anything badly in this world because it could come back, and they hold a grudge, let's say. What's your impersonation of that?
Do you think it was just, as you say, poetic language, or do you think there's some like truth in there? Because in the Bhagavad Gita, when God talks with Arjuna, most of it is like exceptionally like logical and scientific, but then there's various verses, like in chapter 3, where he talks about making sacrifices to the demigods, and now this becomes a bit mysterious, because it doesn't, Krishna doesn't specify or like qualify what those demigods are. But then obviously Guruji, thankfully, we have his translation and description of the verses, and he said that the various forces in the universe are operated by lots of different energies, and hence you have to pay your respect to all these different energies that are playing their part. And in India, we actually not only named those energies, we actually put like a face to them and like symbology to them, and then it sounds very much like paganism, but it goes much deeper than that, obviously, in that section of the Gita, for example, and what Guruji describes. But yeah, I was just wondering if here he was just talking about poetic license, poetic language, or was he talking about something far deeper that isn't really explained here for us?
When I first heard that, I mean, there must be tigers also in the astral plane, right? And then Sri Yukteswar says that animals in the astral plane can take human form temporarily, right? Am I the only one who kind of imagined like a big council of tiger like souls or something? Together. This must stop. This is outrageous.
I don't know about a council. Sort of, how do you say it? We're personifying or projecting our sort of human traits on tigers. But maybe, I mean, that's quite fun to think about. I'll give you that. All I know is that Yogananda does keep things very simple for us. He doesn't get into what I suppose he could get into with the reality of the world and how things work to such a degree that might actually distract us. It keeps things very simple and pure for us to keep us focused and keep the attention on where it should be, which is the practice and God and everything else, I suppose, that the information might come from it to us by other means. But Yogananda for sure keeps things pretty straightforward, which I think is a really good trait for us to follow. So we don't know, but I would, through my interpretation, I think there probably is truth to it in some way. Certainly in the animal kingdom in general, but specifically, let's say that the jungle family, as is referenced here, it has some resentment against the Tiger Swami, and no doubt it's true. He's gone down the wrong path, humiliating these poor tigers, and he warns the Tiger Swami that sometime it may act to your cost. And so we have another pushback here from the Tiger Swami. He still doesn't want to believe it. He's hard-headed. And he says that, to your point, Priyank, about poetry, there's a really lovely bit in here, isn't there? As it's well written, at least, by the Tiger Swami. He describes the tigers as beautiful but merciless, that his blows might inject some sanity of consideration into their thick heads. Quite strong words there by him. And he says then, I am a master in a forest, finishing school to teach them gentle manners. So that's quite the line, isn't it? That's how he envisages himself, and how we all live in delusion and give ourselves reason to do things where we definitely don't need to do. But that's his line. So he's the headmaster in the forest, finishing school. But yeah, his dad is saying that, look, the jungle family is very upset with him. They want the headmaster out, basically. Priyank?
Yeah, Self-Realization Fellowship is like the finishing school for the soul evolution, isn't it? We're on the final home straight, final 100 meter sprint, and Guruji is our headmaster, and we also call him master, isn't it? Probably because of that same reason. Yeah,
quite right. Yeah, good comparison. So then we have this self-proclaimed headmaster sort of pushing the father away and saying, please, father, think of me as a tiger tamer, not as a tiger killer. So again, he's trying to justify his actions, and he's sort of accusing his dad, his own father, of bringing ill upon him. So again, this is kind of the ego play, right? So he's kind of like, hey, you're the one to blame. I don't want to take any of the blame. Beating these tigers up and making them do tricks in front of people. I'm going to blame my dad if anything bad happens to me. So he sort of pushes his dad away in a rather sort of vulgar fashion. And then he goes on to say that he sort of begs his father not to impose any command that might change his own way of life. So some strong words by the Tiger Swami there, really stubborn and refusing sort of to give in to his dad's more wise words of advice. Right?
Vulgar, and as you said, it was very childish. And you know, and this is often when family criticize us, this is often the way we usually respond, isn't it? Like we think that they're out to spoil what our plans are, so we just conform to whatever they want us to do, and then it comes out in this kind of really quite vulgar language, and especially in this scenario where he's actually saying something that's for his highest good, but he's probably through many years of not a great relationship with his father. He's just responding the way any teenager around the world does when the parents telling them to do something that they don't want to do. But it's a good lesson for teenagers, isn't it? don't always assume that you know what's best for you, even if you're good at taming tigers. It may not be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and it brings me on to, I suppose, an observation that there's a really strong message here, from what I can see, that there's this resistance to change, which is common within us all, really. But we should be spiritualizing our actions in life. We really should be spiritualizing them. And when I was looking this up, we'll not play it now because it's a 4-minute and 38-second video, but we can include it in the summary. So if you want to go check it out, feel free to jump in and watch this video. And it's a video by Brother Anandamoy, and it says how to spiritualize your actions. And he then talks about identifying the universal human need that lies at the core of all spiritual seeking. And absolute fulfillment cannot be found in this physical world. That he says really comes through direct experience of God. Such a lovely video that I watched in sort of doing some research for this episode. But like I said, we'll not play it now in the podcast, but feel free to pause and maybe jump in, check out that link. I think it's the Tiger Swami had a sort of somebody put an arm around him at this time, and maybe Brother Anandamoy was there to sort of guide him better. Maybe he would have avoided his fate, which brings us on to the saint's ominous prediction. And we have Yogananda, saying as young Mukunda, him and his friend were standing, to attention that they were reliving this past dilemma that the Tiger Swami had been through. And you might be able to speak to this a little bit more than anybody here on the podcast, but Yogananda Mukunda highlights that it's not common, or at least it's not taken lightly, to disobey parents' wishes. So this was recognized by Yogananda, the culture, maybe in India, I'm not sure, but it's probably like that around the world, right? That you try not to disobey your parents' wishes because they tend to be the people in this world that really want the best for you. So it's recognized there, the love of the parent coming in, that he's just sort of, Tiger Swami discards so easily.
Many a Bollywood film. Bollywood is the Indian cinema industry, film industry is called Bollywood. Many a Bollywood film, the biggest premise of the film is a father disobeys or religiously obeys. A son obeys or religiously obeys or disobeys what the father or mother has said, and then the whole plot keeps thickening, and then it always comes down to this moment where he's either gone this way or that way because of parents' advice. And so many films are just on that principle. So yeah, it's very common. It obviously here it's true in the West as well, but I think in India it's taken to a really big level. It is like sacrilege often, and it can be beneficial but also destructive as well, as you can imagine.
I imagine very much so. And thanks to the Bollywood producers that are guiding us, even in their small amount, spiritually, I suppose. We've all got our role. Bollywood plays theirs. I thought this was really lovely here that Tiger Swami's story continues, and he says that his father was in stoic silence and listened to the explanation. And he calls it an explanation that the Tiger Swami himself gave to his father, if you can call it that. And he says that the father then compelled himself, or the Tiger Swami compelled him to relate this ominous prediction. And there was a saint that had approached him on the veranda as he was doing his daily meditation. So we know that he is consistent in his meditations, doing them daily on the veranda, the father. And so the saint approaches him and he says, in very strong language, I think it's safe to say that, that he comes with a message for your belligerent son. And if you, again, need to look that word up, essentially it's aggressive. Your son's displaying aggression. And that he calls them a savage, or savage activities, and that the next tiger encounter shall result in severe wounds with 6 months of deathly sickness. So these, very strongly worded predictions are coming to the father. That must have been very alarming for the father. Imagine somebody just coming up to you and saying these things would be very, very alarming. But he does then give some positive prediction that he'll essentially survive it, but he's going to have to forsake the former ways and become a monk, or he will do this. So it's at least some positivity there at the end. You would think that he's probably quite happy with that result. I would have thought. Priyank?
Interesting. This monk doesn't give all the information, because he doesn't just become, the Tiger Swami doesn't just become a monk, he becomes a monk, a disciple of the person that's made, the guru that's made this prediction. So he kind of doesn't say the whole thing, he only tells part of it. Maybe the father, if he'd said the whole thing, maybe the father would have been like, yeah, he's crazy, he's after devotees for his path, whereas he's obviously a genuine master, and he's a Tibetan master. And so he didn't say more than he needed to. Another lesson for us.
Yeah, I think also it says quite a lot that this saint approached his father while he was in meditation. I wouldn't dare to disrupt anyone's meditation, it's such a big thing. So the message must have felt very important to relay in that moment, but it's curious as to, why that moment? Why couldn't he have waited? But thank goodness he didn't wait and just relayed the message.
What are you going to do, Lauren, if one day you have to lock up the center, but someone's just meditating past the allocated time?
Depends on the center's rules. I am a rule follower.
I know what this would do.
This is a great. I think everyone knows what I would do.
You can't leave the king.
This is a very grey area.
I would just politely, if there were no absolute restrictions, I think this would be a sign for me to then go meditate longer. So I'd probably just sit down next to them and just meditate more.
You've got to be out by 9 o'clock, Lauren. Lights out.
See, if that's the rule, then we're doing it.
You can see the teacher, the stricter side of Lauren coming out.
Yeah.
Back to the way that the prediction of the sadhu, right? I feel like this also represents different ways of how we can learn things in life. That's what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, right? We can learn through wisdom, or we can also learn through experience. And so I feel like the sadhu gives him the option to just take the wisdom straight from him, or make the experience that he needs to make, and he chooses the latter.
Yeah.
Which would you choose, Mike?
I'd probably do the same. Yeah.
Without
like looking looking at my life.
To be honest, I think we're probably all in the Tiger Swami's category.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we would be
Yeah.
self-realized, wouldn't we?
Although when they say when the student is ready, the teacher appears, right? So he must have almost been there in a sense, because his teacher, the greatest one of all, his guru, came knocking on his door basically to try to get to him through his dad, you know. So it's almost a direct, like, knocking, you know, on his medulla. So he's obviously kind of calling out. He's, yeah, knock, knock, I'm here, you know, like God's on the doorstep, you know, calling you over. So it's a very, very strong indication, really, isn't it, that the Tiger Swami was just on the cusp of turning to God.
That's probably the worst way to stop someone's meditation, isn't it? To knock on their medulla.
Knocked him out.
Yeah, they just
Wait, so
astral body goes flying or something.
did I miss something? Or how do we know the saint is the one that will become his guru?
We do later on.
Later on the episode.
He finds him. He goes back and finds this saint, and he becomes his guru.
This exact. Evidently, I haven't read the chapter as many times as I should have done.
we should come with, you know, bleeps with Priyank talk sometimes, just bleep it out.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's important to go forwards and then backwards, because you would have missed that he didn't reveal the whole information there, and for a purpose, right? It was important.
Yeah. So there's his guru sort of knocking on the door, so to speak. And so the Tiger Swami's ready, almost ready. But even at that point, he says himself that the tale didn't impress me. So even though he, you know, somewhere deep in his soul, you know, he's crying out for this guru to come into his life, he then doesn't recognize it, which is incredible, really, you know, as a lesson that the truth might be right in front of us, but yet through our ignorance being so strong that we still reject it. We still reject truth. So he rejects it. He says, no, doesn't impress me. And that he considered that his father had been the credulous victim of a deluded fanatic. And I just thought, wow, what a classic projection of one's own self here by the Tiger Swami. So, I mean, this chapter, part of the chapter is just filled with lessons, isn't it? You know, we could just sit and meditate on some of the points that we discussed today. And I'm sure, well, I will for sure. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story that Yogananda then gives to us to digest as we're doing on this podcast. But that concludes this part of the chapter. And so we will go on to the third part by Lauren. Lauren will cover that on the next episode. And should be able to finalize it with Mike. So we've got a couple more episodes for you to come on this chapter. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Thank you very much for your contributions. Is there anything else you would want to cover before we call it a day?
No, it was very good. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Lovely. Well, Jai Guru, thank you for tuning in. See you next week.
Jai Guru.
Tiger.